I don't know. What do you think?
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's
All right. We're here. Sorry for the delay, everyone. Um, Thank you for joining. My name is Morgan Harding, and I'm an event manager for Politics and Prose. Soon, I will drop a link in the chat for where you can order a copy of Becoming Abolitionists, Police Protests in the Pursuit of Freedom, straight from PNP's website. You can ask our speakers a question tonight by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can toward the end of the program, but we apologize in advance if we don't have time to address your question. Unfortunately, we had some technical difficulties, and the event will still stop around 7 p.m., although we started a little late. Let me go ahead and introduce tonight's guest. Derecka Purnell is a human rights lawyer, writer, and organizer. She received her JD from Harvard Law School and works to end police and prison violence by providing legal assistance, research, and training to the community-based organizations through an abolitionist framework. Her work and writing has been featured in the New York Times, NPR, The Atlantic, The Boston Globe, and many other publications. She is the co-creator of the COVID-19 Policing Project and the Community Resource Hub for Safety Accountability, and a columnist at The Guardian. She is currently a scholar in residence at Columbia Law School. Purnell will be in conversation with Michelle Alexander, a highly acclaimed civil rights attorney, advocate, legal scholar, and author of the New York Times bestseller, The New Jim Crow: Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. The New Jim Crow helped spark a national debate about crisis of mass incarceration in the United States and inspired racial justice organizing and advocacy efforts nationwide. Please give a virtual round of applause for our guests.
Well, thank you so much for having us. And Derecka, it is such a pleasure to be with you today. I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to participate in the launch of your book, Becoming Abolitionists. I want to start by saying congratulations. This is such an important contribution at a pivotal moment, and I am thrilled to be able to support your work in this way. I have so many questions that I could ask you tonight, but I'm going to try to stick to three themes, just so you know where I'm headed here. I want to talk to you about your personal transformation, what's required for our collective liberation, and then I want to ask you about faith, whether your decision to embrace abolition as a path is for you an act of faith. But before I begin with the questions, I want to say on a personal note how moved I am by this moment. I think we met about a decade ago, not long after The New Jim Crow was first released. You were still a student then, weren't you? I think you said that I was the first civil rights lawyer you ever met, and now here we are, a decade later, and you're the one with a book launch, and I'm the one supporting you as you seek to share what you've come to know and believe about our criminal injustice system and the necessity for bold, courageous, and truly radical change. To be honest, I lacked enough imagination a decade ago to believe that you or anyone would soon be publishing books about abolition that would be entering the mainstream. You know, back then, few people even wanted to hear about the drug war, much less abolition of prisons or the police. But by 2020, there were signs in the streets saying defund the police. And you launched your book the other night on The Daily Show with Trevor Noah, which was an excellent interview, by the way. You know, 10 years ago, it seemed like a pipe dream that abolition would be in the mainstream. But now, thanks to brilliant, visionary, and relentless organizing and political education by countless people and the movements born of grief over horrific violence, police violence, and killing captured on video, we're in a drastically different place. And you personally are in a drastically different place. Part of what makes your book so powerful is that you are open and honest about the fact that you held very different views in your youth than you do today. And you walk the reader through your transformation, helping us to see that our own transformation and evolution is possible as well. And I want to add, and then I promise I'll let you talk, that it's clear from your story that your life doesn't conform at all to the negative caricature of abolitionists being white academics who are so out of touch with life in the hood that they think the police should be abolished there while they enjoy safety and security in their own neighborhoods. You know, you grew up surrounded by a great deal of violence and grief, and the questions surrounding crime and violence are not hypothetical for you. In fact, you start out your book by saying that when you were a kid, your family called the police for everything, and that you thought back then that abolition was an absurd idea. And even into college on many issues, you might be categorized as a somewhat conservative Christian. So the question presented by your book and even the title is, what's changed? And so I hope we can begin at the beginning of your journey toward abolition. Can you share with us a little bit about your childhood, how you viewed the police in your youth, and how you would characterize the person you were back then? What political consciousness did you have before college? It seems like traditional right-left dichotomies fail here. But who were you at the beginning of your journey toward abolition?
What an introduction, Michelle. I think we can all go home now. Like, that was just so beautiful and so powerful. And the first thing I asked you was to not make me cry. So I'm over here shaking, trying to keep it together because it's just so beautiful and so thoughtful. And I would not have imagined that we would be in conversation like this today, 10 years later. It's literally shocking. So just thank you. I know how incredibly busy you are trying to make sure that we're all building the world that we want. So I just feel incredibly honored that you took time to even read the book, to talk to me and think with me about these ideas, to challenge me around some of my arguments, and now to be in conversation with me. So I want to say thank you. And then for the people who all tuned in tonight, thank you so much for bearing with us, for waiting on Zoom for an extra 13, 14 minutes for us to begin. It means a lot to me that you decided to stick around. So I also want to say that. So who was I? Oh man, where was my political consciousness? Yeah, so in the book, I talk about my mom and my grandmother a lot because those were the people who primarily raised me. My mom and my grandmother lived next door to each other. And my grandmother was a poet. And I always thought it was funny that she had this secret beef with Maya Angelou, right? She was like, still I rise, I can write still I rise. And so I grew up in this very interesting household of like Black women who were funny, who were caretakers, and who were fierce. My mom was a comedian. And also, she wouldn't probably consider herself an activist, but she talked to us a lot, me and my 5 siblings, a lot about social movements, a lot about civil rights movements, a lot about the Black Power movement. That's how I first learned about Angela Davis. Right? It was through my mother. You know, whenever she would wash my hair and I would have an afro, she would say, "Oh, you my little Angela Davis, you my little Angela Davis." And so very early, you know, she told me that I had to either become a doctor or a lawyer. And ultimately, I guess we chose the path of law because she thought that Black people needed lawyers to defend them, and to defend them from lots of people, usually institutions, usually landlords, usually people who are trying to take their children from their home and put them in the houses of others. And so I think having a goal like that as a kid, like you need to become a civil rights lawyer, you need to be, she would say Johnny Cochran, we can debate about whether Johnny Cochran was a civil rights lawyer, but she would say you need to be this kind of lawyer to make sure that people can, you know, have justice, can get justice. And I feel really grateful to have that as a goal to chase, even though now that lawyers are so problematic and maintain so much more oppression than they do dismantle it. But I am grateful that my mom pushed me to think about what justice means in a lot of different contexts. Also in that community, you know, was, I would say, half African-American, half East African. And so I would spend my time like learning about people from different parts of the world, very different from the neighborhoods that I grew up with. And so I remember wanting so desperately to be Muslim, and you know, my friends would say, you know, you can just wear a hijab and my mom will let you like come over more. And so having conflicting ideas about religion and faith and identity. My mom wasn't Christian, but I grew up around like Black women who went to church every day, who pressed their shirts. And it was a very, very important like characteristic of how we, you know, protect ourselves. You protect yourselves by praying, by being faithful. I found myself attracted to a lot of ideas about the world, of what it meant to be a good person, a kind person, a faithful person. And so it's, when you said that it didn't necessarily fall on the left-right political spectrum, I think that's true for a lot of people. It's more messy. I think a lot of us have many contradictory, conflicting, interesting sets of ideas and paradigms in politics. So my mom, you know, we would have conversations about sex very, very early, including about sexual violence. And she would say, you know, ain't no welfare or food stamps coming to my house. And what she was essentially saying is that if you get pregnant, we don't have the means to take care of it, take care of a baby. And I watched my mom, you know, for years refuse aid, refuse state aid, right? And we needed it. But the idea of receiving government assistance was so stigmatized, especially if there's usually these stories about people who get over on the system and they're like hustling the system. But I grew up with people who rejected government aid, who rejected welfare and food stamps because they thought that they subscribed to these conservative ideas about laziness and Blackness, right? And so this is a community with a lot of pride and trying to figure out like how to raise their children to have a certain level of dignity. And once I got older and learned about that stigma, I was like, Mom, we actually needed food stamps. Don't be turning away, you know, resources. You know, you're not poor because it's anything you did specifically as a person. And so, yes, it's having to examine a lot of beliefs that I held just by virtue of being raised like in South St. Louis, and then finding people who took some of those unexamined beliefs and pushed me to develop a political analysis around them. And that's, I don't know if that was before I became an abolitionist, but I know that I'm constantly in that process of looking at these ideas and beliefs that I have about the world and being forced to question and examine them politically.
So, you know, in the introduction, you write, initially, the notion of police abolition repulsed me. The idea seemed like it was created by white activists who did not know the violence I knew that I felt. At the time, I considered abolition to be pejoratively utopic. I'd seen too much sexual violence and had buried too many friends to consider getting rid of the police in St. Louis, let alone across the nation. I still lose people to violence. Mm-hmm. And so, as a young person, how did you understand the police and their role in the community and in your life? And how did you understand the violence that was happening around you and what might solve it?
Yeah, so similar to what I said before, I had pretty unexamined ideas about the police. I took them to be a normal fixture in society, kind of like a male person or a teacher. It's like you have a police, a cop in your neighborhood. And I think part of that was because in my elementary school, we would have cops come to our classrooms and like show us their badges, show us their guns, and just like, oh yeah, this is normal, right? I also experienced discrimination and violence like from police, right? I talk about in another conversation I just had, I just remember like, oh yeah, the people I know who were removed from their parents' homes to go to foster care, the social workers showed up with police, like they showed up with cops. And I remember as a kid, if you got evicted, a sheriff would show up, like a cop would show up, right? If you got in trouble at school, a school police officer would show up. So in all these instances where there was violence, right, where you were being evicted, you were in trouble for violating some usually arbitrary rule, a cop would sort of show up. And I figured that it was bad. You know, I witnessed violence from police, especially against, you know, friends of mine. I remember, you know, watching this boy get into like some pushing back and forth, and he accidentally fell back on a school resource officer. And this is one that we all loved, right? This was like one of the good ones. And I remember how hard he punched that boy in response, and just being shook, sitting from the school bus window that this just happened in front of me, and to watch him be in that place the next day. I had known about the rumors that a school resource officer had gotten a student pregnant, right? And just being like, wait, what? Like this happening? So I knew these individual instances. And I also knew that my mom had friends who were cops, right? I knew a kid in my neighborhood who wanted to become a police officer because he saw a white man bring a box of guns, you know, to sell to Black kids right in our backyard. He ultimately became a cop, right? So there were all of these different instances, all these different moments, but it wasn't until I started getting an analysis around policing that came much later around college that I was like, oh, you know, and that was through the immigration context. It was like, oh, Border Patrol cops, they're here to keep immigrants out, especially Spanish-speaking immigrants from, you know, Central and South and America and Mexico. So that was one of the first times I started thinking about the function of policing was through an immigration context. And then over time was pushed to think about all of those individual instances where cops were just enforcing further violence against people who were poor, against Black women, against people who had been class exploited. And that came with time.
So what changed your views? If you started off when you were first encountered, I guess maybe it would be worth you identifying when you first encountered the notion of police abolition. And if when you first encountered the notion of police abolition, it repulsed you. What began to change your mind? I mean, maybe you could even identify like 2 or 3 of the pivotal moments or challenges being introduced to challenging new ideas that change your mind, or things that happened that really shifted your perspective. Were they things that happened to you that you witnessed, or was it, information you encountered or analyses you encountered for the first time that really began to open your mind to the possibility that there might be something wrong with your worldview, and that another way is possible?
Yeah, so when I first came across abolition, there were just students in college who were, sort of talking about abolition, and I just immediately was just dismissive or antagonistic, or I didn't really take them seriously. And this is before I even understood what abolition was, right? It's the common response I get from other people when I first talk about abolition. They're just like, that's not even a realistic thing. And I'll say, well, what have you read? Like, who have you talked to? Like, what do you mean? And then I realized, like, oh, you actually don't even know what I mean when I say this particular thing. So that was my first reaction. I just kind of just like over it. Like, this is not even like a real thing. Just gonna sort of move on. I mean, those same groups of students were also talking about like the abolition of borders. I mean, all of these like big picture ideas that would require a complete transformation of society, I just wasn't ready to entertain. It just was like, okay, I don't have time for that. I'm gonna go do this real work and like become a civil rights lawyer and fight in the criminal legal system. But then after Darren Wilson killed Michael Brown in Ferguson, there was an uprising. And the beautiful things about uprisings and social movements is that there are all these ideas that start spurring, like how do we fix this crisis that our society has decided is worth encountering? Like how do we figure out this policing stuff? And early on, I was very attracted to a lot of the reforms that were on the table because it seemed like something, right? It felt like, oh, we can buy body cameras. we can diversify police departments. We can have more police training. We can ensure that police come from the communities that they patrol and surveil. We can do these things. I remember writing for them. I was on, like organizing boards, trying to get them implemented. And I was really excited about them because I thought that this would alleviate some of the violence that so many of us had experienced. And so once I started joining student organizations and student movements with people from really all over the world who were asking different kinds of questions about who we wanted to be in the world and what we ultimately thought the role of policing should be. And through those deep debates and discussions and reading, I mean, we took political education very, very, very seriously. And that's because we were largely inspired by students who were organizing in South Africa under Fees Must Fall and Roads Must Fall. And so watching those students engage in political education, reading different political texts to develop an awareness, to raise their level of consciousness, to then inform their demands about the kinds of society that they wanted to have, we were so inspired to do the same thing. Right. So we started reading very, very widely. We started asking different kinds of questions. Well, we know that KRS-One calls, police overseers and slave patrols. Like, what's this thing really about? So the more that we studied, the more that we struggled, the more that we tried to sharpen our political analyses in a way that would strengthen our demands, because we had a lot of good ideas. We just didn't have the political analysis around whether they would lead us towards liberation or lead us towards something we're going to have to fight to tear down later. And so it was being in a social movement where people were asking more transformative questions that I think ultimately pushed me to even be open to consider to reading certain types of political texts, right? To listen to certain kinds of, music, to watching certain kinds of films, learning about colonialism and the anti-colonial struggles. It's like when people ask me, like, what should I read? I always say it's great that you want to read books, and we need people to read books, because reading books, that's a good thing. Like, this is a book talk. We want people to read books, but we should try to do that in community. So when we're struggling and we're building our political analysis, it can help us use that information towards freedom. And I think being in social movements helped me do that.
So it's interesting because you're describing a process of transformation that doesn't turn on a single event or something that happened to you that you witnessed, but rather a transformation that began and grew through a period of years of organizing, discussion and debate, political education, and being in constant dialogue and being challenged by people who perhaps were more advanced in their political consciousness or in a process of awakening through study and struggle right along with you. Would you say that either Trayvon Martin or any of the other kind of widely publicized police killings that many people point to as moments of either awakening or moments at which they kind of for the first time takes to the streets or the first time became radicalized, were any of those moments pivotal or influential to you, or did you maybe experience them as kind of just one of many moments around which you were organizing and struggling during that period of time? Or do you view those as—
Can I say yes to both? That it was both, that there were several moments that in isolation, it would seem like that particular incident was like a pivotal moment. So when the Jenna 6 from Jenna, Louisiana, for example, were being charged with assault with a deadly weapon because they kicked a white kid with like a tennis shoe, right? After a group of white kids hung a noose on a tree that students had reserved for white students. I remember being shocked and surprised by that. But then I was like, oh, that's just like a thing in the South. Like, I think Louisiana is kind of bad. Or when Kanye West got on television and said, George Bush, George Bush doesn't like Black people, or George Bush hates Black people. I remember being like, what is this? What is going on? What is he talking about? And then watching the images of people drown and swim and try to escape with their belongings, leaving New Orleans, searching for refuge. I was like, oh, this is like a horrible thing. Louisiana is really, really, something's going on in the South. And then when Sean Bell was killed in New York City, I thought it was just a horrible, tragic incident. Like, here's this man who's unarmed, he's in his car, it's the night before he's about to get married, and you have the police surround his car and shoot it up. And then what happens? You know, he dies. I thought it was just tragic, but I didn't know the full history of police violence. And unfortunately, I guess I don't even know how many people police killed, because just the other day, the New York Times reported that homicides related to police violence are severely undercounted. And so back then, I don't think that there was a way for people, well, there was a way, but there weren't like these deaths people were keeping track of them the way that we're keeping track of them today. But still, I thought, oh man, it's a terrible incident that's in New York City, or Oscar Grant in California. Oh man, it's so horrible that this happened. It's so tragic. And I wasn't realizing fully this sort of pattern that was emerging. So even when Trayvon Martin was killed by George Zimmerman, one of the things I remember writing on Facebook was like, oh man, I hope that doesn't make relationships between police and Black people more intense than what it already is, right? I described it as tension, right? Like racial violence. I worried that it would make police more likely to harm Black people, or that Black people will become more vulnerable to violence from police. But I didn't yet have that systemic analysis. And even, up until Michael Brown, up through Freddie Gray, when Freddie Gray was killed by a group of Baltimore cops in 2015, I remember just being like, God, please let these officers get convicted. Like, please, 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 like, let them get convicted. And they were charged. The charges were ultimately dropped for all of them. And I was like, wow, even when we get this close, we can't even get a conviction. We can't get what I thought at the time was justice. And so I think watching the failures of the demands that we were trying to implement initially definitely helped to politicize me, right? But I also think even sometimes when we won, it still didn't undermine the violence. So police convictions has started increasing since the Black Lives Matter movement emerged in 2014, but it wasn't as if the police killings necessarily stopped, right? So it's like, well, I don't want police just to go to prison after they kill people. I want them to not kill people in the first place. And then, I don't want them to be taking poor people to jail. I don't want them to be enforcing evictions, all the things I saw in my childhood. And so it definitely was messy, not very linear, even though, not very linear, but I think it's important that, I had an opportunity to take a step back to see how each of these moments sort of created a picture for me to help shape that analysis around what police are ultimately for.
Well, there were two places or moments in your book that really stood out to me as, potentially being pivotal, although maybe I overread it. That one was when after you'd graduated from Harvard Law School, and you were working on consent decrees.
Oh, yeah.
And beginning to see how many times consent decrees have been tried and failed, and how futile the process of trying to achieve police reform through litigation seemed to be, and beginning to kind of question whether this, you had already begun to question, but in many ways it seemed to be your work, those consent decree, and that consent decree seemed to kind of solidify in you, or be a turning point where you're beginning to think that perhaps trying to achieve justice through litigation and police reform was kind of doomed to fail. And then there was another moment when you went to South Africa.
Oh, yeah.
And you were doing your organizing work in South Africa and witnessed police violence by Black police officers and endorsed by political leaders that were part of the ANC, which had once been the revolutionary, force in South Africa that had ushered Nelson Mandela into power, and, talking with and working with activists who, were beginning to ask these questions around kind of police abolition, that your own thinking around Black leadership and whether policing can be saved really deepened in important ways. Does that resonate for you?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the consent decree it's so frustrating, and it's so it just made me really, really angry. I don't even have like the politically correct words to describe how it made me feel, that there was so much hope when President Obama and Eric Holder kind of swooped into Ferguson and a lot of other places, Chicago, Cleveland, Cincinnati, said, we have these consent decrees, we're going to use them, we're going to change police departments. And if you look at the Ferguson consent decree, it's filled with all these provisions to build trust in the community, to ensure constitutional policing. And you have this law review article in this book by Paul Butler, which just, even before I stepped foot back in Ferguson, what he does in this article and what ultimately became chokehold, he says, look, all of these provisions in this consent decree, they're trying to actually constrain the constitutional power of the Ferguson Police Department to be violent, right? And so that moment, it actually clicked for me that, well, what we're fighting against is not necessarily unconstitutional policing that consent decrees are trying to fix. We're trying to fight against constitutional policing that's inherent to the institution. And a consent decree just can't solve that, it just can't fix it. You can't just reform an institution that's already constitutionally policing. And so that was especially pivotal because you have people who lived in Ferguson who are so faithful to going to court, so faithful to going to meeting after meeting, talking to DOJ attorneys, talking to the city of Ferguson officials, really trying to fight for police reform, and still are trying to fight for police reform in that system. And to know how little power the judge would grant them in speaking at hearings, so they're only allowed to speak every 6 months to detail how the process is going, to watch the Ferguson, to watch the city of Ferguson hire a Black lawyer to defend the city's actions, right? To hear that Black lawyer tell the judge, look how much progress Ferguson is making. They hired me, I'm a Black lawyer, right? This is all in transcript. This is all in the court transcripts, right? To watch them defend the pace that the Ferguson Police Department was moving to implement the changes in the consent decree, to watch the DOJ, again, Obama's DOJ, defend the city's reluctance to dismiss thousands of old cases where people had warrants that were 5, 10, 15 years old. So to witness all of that and to watch this community fight for that to be changed. And all the cameras are gone now. All of Ferguson is now described as like an event when Ferguson happened. When people are still there fighting for that level of change, facing evictions for their organizing, for their activism, just to see all of that happen and put all of that hope in a consent decree was incredibly infuriating. And I think that it's the only thing that's very excited about that are the people who are committed to still figuring out how to stop police violence in that city, right? So absolutely pivotal for me as a lawyer. And then for South Africa, yeah, I mean, what can I even say? One of the days that I was in Cape Town, in Johannesburg, there were students there who were occupying the university who were trying to stop fee increases, right? They wanted free education. They wanted to stop the increase in tuition. And to watch them be met with such brutal force from private Black security that the university hired to kick them out, I mean, I described the brutality in the book, and it's just a lot for me to recount aloud right now, but it was just harrowing. And you realize like, oh yeah, just because someone's Black, it doesn't mean that they're going to be less repressive or violent towards you if they're committed to maintaining a system of hierarchy, right? If they're committed to maintaining levels of oppression. And since students were calling those people out, they were met with violence and force. Just as we look in Puerto Rico, for example, in the US context, the majority of the police officers in Puerto Rico are Puerto Rican, they're brown. It doesn't mean that the people in Puerto Rico experience less violence just because of the color of the skin of the officers, right? That's not the case. And so it showed very brightly, like one example of a limitation of diversity that then made me put these other pieces together. Like, oh yeah, we just can't have more brown, more Black, more women cops, in order to change this, we actually have to eradicate the entire institution.
So how would you define abolition? The goal of abolition, and when you say I'm an abolitionist now, what does that mean to you?
Well, when I say that I'm an abolitionist, I would say that I belong to a community and a tradition of people who are committed to eradicating the carceral state and eradicating the reasons why people think they need the carceral state to solve social problems. And so it's not just making police and prisons disappear overnight, but it's a political commitment and vision and practice of trying to figure out, why do people think they need this system in the first place, right? How do we eradicate that? How do we fix that? How do we actually address that? Instead of continuing to invest in policing and prisons and surveillance, I don't want to even call them as solutions, but essentially as a national jobs program to manage the fallout of capitalism, colonialism, homophobia, racism, and inequality, right? So we have to eradicate both. It's not just prisons and police and surveillance, right? It's not just the carceral state, but it's also eliminating these reasons why people rely on the carceral state. And then when I think about the exciting parts of it, it's also to build the future that we want, to build the present that we want, to create just relationships between each other, between our planet, within our communities. Like that is the world that we're actively trying to build. And I see myself as a part of that tradition.
And so to transition, since we're running out of time, I want to hear your thoughts about what's required of us now to get there for our collective liberation. And do you see abolition as an achievable goal? You explore this, I think very well in your book. And so I'd love for you to say a little bit about what it means to work towards abolition, what's required of us now, and if you see it as an achievable goal in your lifetime.
So I very sadly do not see the total abolition of the carceral state as a goal that's achievable in my lifetime. And I'm very jealous of the people in the future who will achieve that goal because I would not be there. But I think that what's required of us is to make the sacrifices in order to make that future possible for other people, right? I think
what are those sacrifices?
Yes, I think that people,
like in a concrete way, what do you want?
Well,
people to do or hope that they will do?
I would love that people do two very specific things. I think people should absolutely join an organization and find people to read and think with so they can develop a political analysis around abolition, right? I think that the more that we get to understand what people mean, what we say when we say abolition, I think that's absolutely, because you can have a lot of good ideas, but without developing a political analysis about how this relates to the long term, then you could be doing things that actually don't make a lot of sense for you or for the future. And we know this, we do this with other things. If you have a savings goal, you think about how much money do I want to save to accomplish this goal? And you make incremental investments towards reaching that goal, which means you have to learn information about, how do I save money? How do I budget? How do I do all these other things that make reaching that goal possible? So I think for abolition, I think people should join other people in trying to figure out and study together what that is. I think a second thing right now is for people to join organizations and to think about a campaign that they will be excited about that can help to move us towards that. And the great thing is that can literally be so many different things, right? There's opportunities for people to do climate justice activism through an abolitionist lens, disability justice through an abolitionist lens. There are faith and abolition communities that are trying to figure out how to decouple the church and police, the church and prisons, right? There are people who are trying to figure out how to remove resources for the police and build other options to respond to harm and violence. There's people who work on restorative and transformative justice. There are people who are trying to launch broad national campaigns to eliminate student debt, for universal childcare, universal healthcare. And these things may not seem inherently abolitionist, but if someone can't leave if someone has nowhere to go and they need to leave a relationship or someone that's harmful or abusive to them, then we need the social structures that help to encourage that, right? Because if someone is in a harmful situation, well, that can lead to violence. And so if we want to eradicate violence, we have to build a society that we need to make sure that people have what they need to thrive. And so it's endless. I have a lot of organizations in the book. I have a lot of examples in the book that I hope people just add to. I know I just have one offering, but there's so many different people who are trying to figure out answers to the same questions and have, just a plethora of concrete ways for people to plug in.
All right, well, I want to transition to get some of these questions in. There's some excellent questions that have been sent in to the Q&A, and hopefully you'll get copies of them because, there's a lot here that is really worth diving into and thinking about in terms of how you just talk about this work going forward and respond to questions regarding your book. But first, just really briefly, in your writing and even in some of your interviews, you've talked a little bit about faith and your faith journey. And I myself have, come to think of abolition in some ways as a spiritual practice. If faith is the evidence of things not seen and the substance of things hoped for, that is abolition, the abolitionist practice. And so I'm curious whether kind of in the evolution of your own faith and your own faith journey, whether abolition has become for you in some way an act of faith.
I think so. I was telling Pastor Michael McBride of last year, I think it was last July, I was talking to him about faith and abolition. And at some point I was like, you know what, Pastor Mike, I am so tired of praying to God, asking for the end of white supremacy and the end of police violence. And, if my kids go out into the world, and will they be able to come home safe at night? I don't want to pray to God about stuff like that. And I think that white supremacy, capitalism, racism, I think all of these, what they try to do is deprive us of the lives full of joy, desire, and curiosity. And I'm just wondering, what sorts of things would I spend time talking to God about or praying about if I didn't have to pray for the elimination of unnecessary suffering? Right? Maybe I would pray for purple trees because I think purple trees are cool. Maybe I would, pray for different kinds of problems, different kinds of solutions. I would have different kinds of questions. And instead, I'm usually consumed with praying against oppression, praying for organizers, praying for workers to realize and act on their power against people who own the means of production, right? These are the things that I find myself teaching my kids to pray about. I don't want to do that, right? So I hope that for people of faith or for people of consciousness who are concerned about justice and freedom and truth in the world, I hope that, or at least I think there's an opportunity for us to think about what possibilities in our own faith traditions will open up if we start to eliminate some of the oppression that's in the world. So that's where I see faith intersecting the most with my abolitionist outlook. And yeah, I mean, I'm willing to be pushed. I love learning about how other people have their faith interact with their abolitionist paradigms, their anti-capitalist paradigms, or their feminist paradigms. And I just think there's lots of possibility there.
Okay, thank you for sharing that.
Of course, thank you for that question.
All right, let's run over a little bit if that's okay with politics and prose. I want to get some of these questions in. So I'm going to combine two of them because they're pushing in the same direction. One of the question essentially is, do you feel like working in a legal field somehow legitimizes the system that as an abolitionist, do you want to see the end of? And relatedly, I think, someone asked, do you believe there's room to push the goal of abolition in roles like public defense? So these questions are asking, you know, working in the legal field, are you legitimizing the system as an abolitionist? And can you, in a role like a public defender, actually push the goal of abolition?
Yeah, I love these questions. I usually get these questions from lawyers and law students, right? So I think it depends on what you're doing in the legal system. I think that if you're a prosecutor, then you're not doing abolitionist work. I just don't. Your primary job is to put people in prisons, to put people in jails. And no matter how you spin it, the majority of the people that you're putting in jails or prison are people who are class exploited, people, you know, who are disabled, people who are immigrants. I don't think that's the work of abolition. Do I think you're legitimizing this? Do I think you're legitimizing the criminal legal system if you are a lawyer working with the system? I think if you're a public defender and you're getting people out of jail and you're trying to do your best to free people from the carceral state, I think that's very, very, very important. I think that for lawyers, the one thing I would highly encourage lawyers, especially public defenders, to do, and this is unfair, and my public defender friends are going to be mad at me because I know how busy you are. But I think that it's important to think about other ways to attack the criminal legal system that's not completely related to your job. And so right now, because organizing has become so professionalized, and because what we think of as like a civil rights lawyer is so aligned with what one's salary, we sometimes don't give ourselves room or permission or opportunities even to do political work outside of our jobs, which is very, very, very important. I'm talking about unpaid, dedicated work to a campaign to dismantle the carceral state. So I have friends who are public defenders, but outside of their public defense job, they're on a campaign to close a jail, right? We need lawyers who are able to do both of those things, because I think it just gives you more flexibility in not legitimizing the system, but also helping people who actually really need it. So that would be my answer to those sets of questions.
Let me get at least two more in here. This question, I think, is one that I've wrestled with, as you know, from some of our conversations over the years. It's how would you advise us to fight against not only carceral systems, but also against popular figures and organizations of Black and other marginalized people who have taken the posture of working towards freedom while actually investing in the maintenance of policing, prosecution, imprisonment, capitalism, and the nonprofit industrial complex?
This is a very tough question. And yes, we have talked about this a lot. And I talk about it in one paragraph of the book because it's a very scary thing to talk about, especially when those people aren't usually considered your enemy, right? They're not considered like right wingers or people who deny injustice, but their commitments to eliminating justice actually legitimize capitalism and the nonprofit industrial complex. I think that it depends. If you're inside the organization, I think that you should find other people who are frustrated too inside the organization, and y'all should organize against the people who are maintaining that, including if that's leadership. I think if you're asking about this as a lawyer in one of these organizations, if you don't have a union, I think you should unionize against your organization, within your organization. And I think that you should continue to push, and you should push until it's untenable. You have to make that. I think that we should make those kinds of sacrifices to organize where we are if we don't want that to happen. I think if you're not in that organization, I think you should figure out ways to critique that organization. And I mean, so many people write about this, but all criticism is not, you're not hating, you're not coming after, you're not canceling. You don't have to do that. We need robust criticism of how we approach the work, because ultimately that makes us sharper, right? So before I went to law school, Thurgood Marshall was one of my heroes. And then I went to law school and I realized how much he undermined Black organizers and local chapters of the NAACP. And one point even worked with the feds and to like help dismantle some radical organizing that was more liberatory than the legal work that he was trying to pursue, right? But if we don't have anyone critiquing the Thurgood Marshalls because he's untouchable, because he was the first Black Supreme Court justice, then it actually doesn't help us towards fighting for the world that we want. So if you're inside, unionize and organize. If you're outside, publicly critique when you can.
Yes, excellent. Well, last but not least, what books, obviously let's not quote our own here, what books have changed your perception about government, politics, education, and more? I think here, if you can leave us with some recommended books beyond your own. Everyone should start with yours.
Yes, of course.
That's what we're here for right now. But beyond your own, what books would you recommend?
Oh, this is so hard. I always recommend Freedom Dreams by Robin D.G. Kelley. It's one of the most important books I've ever read in my life. I return to it often because it just gives us glimpses into the Black radical imagination that different people, artists, politicians, organizers, flirt with over time to try to figure out how to pursue this thing that we call justice. So I always talk about Freedom Dreams. Wow, I'm like being overwhelmed. I think Freedom Dreams is a good place to start too, because Robin relies on so many other different texts that invite people to think about other parts of the world. I love Cedric Robinson's Black Movements in America. It's a pretty thin book. Most people, when they talk about Cedric Robinson, they talk about Black Marxism, which is obviously very, very, very important. But Black Movements in America, he just goes through literally each decade and discusses like, this is the activism and resistance that Black people were doing in this time period. I absolutely love that book. Education, I can provide more. I'll put answers on the website or I'll tweet them out or something, but I'm getting overwhelmed with examples. What about you, Michelle?
Well, I could list a whole bunch, but I'm also getting messages that we need to wrap it up right now. So I will let Politics and Prose take it over. And I just want to say thank you so much, Derecka, for your work, not just for this book, but for your willingness to challenge yourself, to organize, and to be challenged, because that's what's most evident in your story, that you have been open to new ideas and to being challenged and to growing and evolving through this work every day. And so I'm very grateful for you and the contributions you're making in this time. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle.
Yes, and on the behalf of Politics and Prose, thank you, Derecka Purnell and Michelle Alexander, for doing this wonderful event with us. We also apologize to you two and the audience for the technical difficulties earlier, and we thank you all for sticking it out with us this evening. If your question was not answered this evening, I'm sure it could be answered in Becoming Abolitionists. So please click on that link in the chat and purchase the book from Politics and Prose. Your book sales are what make these events possible. And we wish you all a great evening.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.